Is the escalation almost out of control? The U.S. gives its strongest warning yet of an imminent Russian invasion, but could Western officials be blowing the threat out of proportion? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today on The Newsmakers, we ask if there really is potential for war. After Russia's annexation of Crimea took much of the world by surprise, Western officials may go to lengths to ensure Moscow doesn't take Donetsk as well. For weeks, we've been hearing speculation that the Kremlin plans to invade eastern Ukraine, with the U.S. Embassy in Kiev now saying Russian military action could come at any time. It's ordered families of diplomats to leave the country, and the UK is withdrawing staff as well. But Ukraine's foreign minister has called the move premature and a manifestation of excessive caution. Now, his statement follows inconclusive talks in Geneva between U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Friday. Now, according to the New York Times, President Joe Biden is considering sending up to 5,000 troops to the region. The U.S. military has reportedly been training Ukrainian forces in insurgency tactics against a possible future Russian occupation. Officials are deeply concerned by the buildup of Russian troops along Ukraine's border. Blinken reiterated on Sunday that Russia would regret any act of aggression.
How significant is the insider threat to President Zelensky and his government?
This is, again, part of the Russian playbook. It's something we are very focused on, and this is why we've been speaking about it. We've raised this publicly in recent weeks. We want to put people on notice and on guard that this is something Russia could do, just as we talked about the possibility of a so-called false flag operation where Russia creates a provocation inside of Ukraine.
Now, in an unusual move, the UK government declassified intelligence to publicly warn that the Kremlin is plotting a coup of sorts in Ukraine. A press release from the Foreign Office said this.
We have information that indicates the Russian government is looking to install a pro-Russian leader in Kiev as it considers whether to invade and occupy Ukraine. The former Ukrainian MP, Yevhen Murayev, is being considered as a potential candidate.
But both Moscow and the man at the center of the accusation have denied those claims. Yevhen Murayev told British media he will sue the UK government for making accusations that are, quote, damaging and absurd. Now, Murayev is not the only one who's questioned the rhetoric emanating from Western capitals. Germany's Navy chief said the idea that Russia wants to invade Ukraine is nonsense. Vice Admiral Kai-Achim Schönbach was immediately condemned for his comments, in which he also suggested that President Putin deserves respect. Within hours, he resigned over the statements he described as ill-considered. A spokesperson for the German Defense Ministry has said his choice of words did not correspond in any way with the German government's position. It nevertheless dealt a blow to the appearance of a unified European stance. EU officials have been quick to reiterate their unity at Monday's Foreign Affairs Council meeting, where Ukraine, once again, topped their agenda.
All members of the European Union are united. We are showing an unprecedented unity about the situation in Ukraine, with a strong coordination with the US, being personally coordinated and participating with all debriefing and being informed of what's going on, no problem with any member state. We'll continue building up our position towards the Russia attempt to undermine the security structure in Europe and to rebuild spheres of influence which are completely updated.
So who is provoking whom and toward what end? Well, joining me now to discuss that from Brussels is historian and Russian affairs analyst Gilbert Doctorow. He's written extensively on Russian, American, and European relations. In Washington is Elisabeth Braw. She is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a columnist with Foreign Policy magazine. And in London is Nikolay Petrov, a senior research fellow on the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House and a political science professor at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Thanks all so much for being with us. I'd like to start then with the big question here, because we've been hearing for weeks that we are on the precipice in this Russia-Ukraine-NATO standoff. Nikolay, could all this escalation genuinely spark a war?
It's hard to answer now. What is for sure is the fact that the Kremlin prepares for the second move. And as the United States, due to understandable reasons, are not eager now to accept all the Kremlin's claims, then the second move will follow. But we can only speculate whether it will be military or military technical, as Mr. Putin has put it, or any other move.
Okay. Let me ask Elisabeth if you're on the same page there.
Well, for all intents and purposes, it looks like an invasion is imminent. But we shouldn't forget that Russia, and in particular Vladimir Putin, likes to surprise his neighbors and the West, and the wider West, I should say. So if we stare ourselves blind at the threat of an invasion of Ukraine, it could well be that we miss something else that he has up his sleeve. And that's what I think we should really be concerned about, because he has shown himself capable of surprising the West over the many years that he has been in power, and especially in recent years.
Okay, Gilbert, would you agree there? Is this really more in Putin's hands?
I think there's a complicity between the United States and Russia in raising the visibility of the risk of war. And why complicity? Because it's to the advantage of both sides to deal with this subject, which has general recognition and which seems urgent, to cover the entry of both parties into discussions on Russian security concerns in Europe, which otherwise would not be discussable. These concerns were raised in 2008 when then President Medvedev placed before the OSCE a similar notion of revising the European security architecture. And that was a non-starter. It received no attention whatsoever in the West. The measures presented on December 15th of last year by the Kremlin to Washington is receiving a lot of attention, reluctantly, slightly belatedly, but it even has come into the public domain where our news agencies are giving attention to Russian concerns in a way they haven't done for the last 20 years.
So, Gilbert, correct me if I'm wrong. Are you saying kind of cynically both parties would have something to gain from escalating this?
On the Russian side, there is nothing cynical about it. Well, I would say on the American side also, because finding a convenient political cover for doing some business which otherwise could be subject to severe criticism from the press and from the political establishment in your country is not cynical, it's just good politics. As for the Russians, they're stationing their 100,000 plus troops and military equipment at the borders of the Ukraine had a very different start. As I said, they've used it as a cover to deal with the bigger issue, the much wider issue of global relations with the United States. But the initial reason for this was not to stage an invasion, but to prevent an invasion. They were concerned that a similar number of military troops, approximately 100,000 soldiers from the Ukrainian armed forces, representing 1/2 of the entire military of Ukraine, had been positioned over months by the Dnieper River within easy striking distance of the Donbass, the two rebelling provinces which have Russian support.
Okay.
And they feared that with all of the weaponry and training and seemingly political backing of the United States and NATO allies, the hotheads in Kiev might be tempted to do something very ugly and initiate a genocide in Donbass, to which the Russians would have to respond militarily and stage that famous invasion.
It's interesting.
The very presence of the Russian troops has prevented that.
Okay. Let me go back to Elisabeth, because as you say, Gilbert, that this is not necessarily cynical, it's just political. Elisabeth, you've written extensively about how there is a big loser in all of this scenario, with both sides escalating the rhetoric, with Russia putting troops on the border because of what it perceives as a NATO threat, and then escalating statements like Joe Biden last week, and then the UK suggesting that Moscow is actually trying to install via a coup of sorts this pro-Kremlin leadership in Kiev, inadvertently hurts Ukraine very badly, primarily by destabilizing its economy.
That's right. And if you think about, if you were an international investor, and there are many international investors who are interested in Ukraine, who have been investing in Ukraine, and of course there are international money markets as well, there is the Ukrainian currency. All of this is being affected by the threat of a Russian invasion. So if you're an investor, you say, well, I think I'll pull my investments out of Ukraine. I see potential in the country, but there would be no way for me to do business in Ukraine if there were a full-scale invasion. And so we're seeing all kinds of indicators, investments, the currency, the sovereign default risk. All of this is sliding and has been sliding for a number of weeks. In fact, so much that Ukrainian officials just a couple of days ago warned that the risk of an invasion is sapping the Ukrainian economy. Now, we should remember the Ukrainian economy is far weaker than, let's say, the Polish economy, which is the neighboring country of similar size. The Polish economy might withstand something like this. The Ukrainian economy is vulnerable and weak as it is. So I would say, if I were Russia, I've achieved a great deal already. I've weakened Ukraine and hampered its efforts to become a viable market economy.
Okay. Nikolay, let me come back to you, and I'd like to get to some of our viewer input. One of our viewers had said, America acts as if it's urging Russia to invade Ukraine. And then when we saw the statements from the Kremlin today saying that East-West tensions are soaring off the back of U.S. and NATO actions and their, quote, information hysteria, and Western information about East-West tensions is laced with lies, I mean, is there a case there to be made for U.S. provocation?
I can hardly share this view, and what's going on, in my view, it's the Kremlin's attempt to humiliate the West publicly. That's why the initial so-called draft treaties were put in a way which is absolutely, well, insulting. And it's not the end of the story. The next move, I think, will demonstrate that neither the United States nor NATO are capable or even are willing to support Ukraine or wherever it will happen in military way. And this is aimed to send rather understandable signal to all post-Soviet countries. So you can make friends with the West, with NATO, with the United States, but do not think that you can do something contrary to Russia's interests. And Russia should demonstrate that it's master in the house, and this house is defined as post-Soviet territory minus Baltic states.
Nikolay, what do you make then of Germany's own Navy chief, and before he resigned, saying basically NATO has to show some respect for Russian leadership and that it was nonsense to think Russia would pour troops into Ukraine? I mean, here's a man on the front lines saying the West is exaggerating.
I think he is a military man. That's why he is perhaps too sincere, and he was in a hurry to say this. I would wait for something similar to be pronounced by many more leaders in a while after we'll see the next move by Putin.
Okay. Gilbert, I want to get your opinion on on the resignation in particular of Germany's Navy chief there. Do you agree with Nikolay?
Well, I think the action in Germany was extraordinary. Extraordinary that a man of that stature and of that position in the military of his country would behave in such a normal human way. I think he's had enough of the political correctness that has come in with the Greens as they entered the coalition in the new German cabinet. And he was expressing his sincere belief that relations do not have to be as conflictual and as threatening as they are. But to come back to the remarks of Nikolay 1 moment ago, I don't think it is reasonable for the leader of one of the world's great powers to risk the existence of his nation, which is what Mr. Putin has done by standing boldly and defying the United States to withdraw to the NATO structure of 1997, that it is unreasonable to think that he would make such a bold and risky move for the sake of humiliating anybody. This man is a chess player. He is a very sophisticated political tactician, and he is engaging in the kind of warfare that was described by the classical German writer and tactician and strategist of the 19th century, von Clausewitz. That is psychological warfare. It's not hybrid warfare. It's not cyber warfare. It's something from the 19th century, because certain verities do not change.
Okay.
And the notion is to achieve what you want without killing anybody.
Nikolay, if you'd like to respond, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in general, I do not disagree totally with Gilbert. But in my view, humiliation of the West or of President Biden is not just to humiliate him and to be happy, demonstrating that you are bigger, you are greater. It's aimed to demonstrate that neither NATO nor United States nor the West in whole are capable to realize all their promises they gave to Ukraine. And I think that at the end of this story, Russia can either win or it can lose. The United States, in my view, can lose only. The problem is whether they will lose more or they will lose less. But the bigger loser, I think, is Ukraine. And it's due to the fact that their expectations based on certain sayings by the West, by Americans, are absolutely groundless. And that's why I think it will be very, very serious cold shower for them.
Okay. Elisabeth, let me come back to you. You know, hearing Nikolay say that the big loser again is Ukraine. Now we have the Ukrainian government itself saying that evacuating diplomatic staff from Kiev is premature and a display of excessive caution. So here's the Ukrainian government itself, you know, in the argument that the UK and the US and NATO is trying to help and defend Ukraine in a sense, saying, don't do what you're doing.
And that illustrates Ukraine's extremely perilous position, because the more the rest of the world or Ukraine's friends keep worrying about the war, keep trying to help Ukraine defend itself, the more it will look like a fait accompli, like a war is inevitable. And of course, the more international investors, international money markets will worry, and the more the Ukrainian economy will suffer. So it's, in a sense, a war could become or Russian invasion could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But on the other hand, it would be extremely cruel for Ukraine's Western allies to not even mention the possibility of an invasion in an effort to protect the Ukrainian economy as long as possible. So it's a really fundamental dilemma for the West, and we should also remember that there isn't really very much one can do as a NATO member state, or that NATO itself can do, unless an invasion happens, because Ukraine is not a NATO member state. You can't send massive amounts of NATO troops there, because there is no obligation within NATO to defend Ukraine. But doing nothing is also not an option.
Right.
So it's an extremely difficult position.
But, you know, this latest escalation, Elisabeth, I'll stick with you for a second, is based on the UK saying that there is this intelligence that the Kremlin is trying to perpetuate this coup in government and install a pro-Kremlin leadership. But, you know, we know that intelligence, especially in the case of the US before, that was intelligence that was backed by the UK, in the case of the build-up to the Iraq War, proved to be entirely false. Should we have right now so much confidence, or should the West at least have so much confidence in what UK intelligence is purporting that the Kremlin is trying to carry out this coup in Ukraine. Would it be irresponsible to take it at face value?
That is the tricky thing about intelligence, is it not? And as I recall, Curveball, who was the man who delivered that intelligence to German intelligence, which was then passed along to the Americans regarding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that was obviously completely false. I think what the UK government was trying to do was to be extraordinarily transparent with the world and also with the UK public. But of course, there is always a risk that what you predict or what you think you have documented, that it is entirely, that it's maybe partially or even entirely wrong. And so it seemed like a little bit of an over bold move to publish that intelligence. And I can only speculate that in doing so, the UK was trying to prevent such a move by the Russians.
Okay.
Because otherwise, why would you put such really explosive information at the disposal of the global public?
Exactly. Nikolay, I want to know what you make of that, because now Yevhen Murayev is saying he could possibly take the UK government to court.
I would not overestimate this information in general. This is clearly an element of psychological war, either from the UK side or from Russia's side. But let's not take it seriously, because it's not the problem of being pro-Russian. It's the problem of keeping being pro-Russian. The current Ukrainian President Zelensky did win against Poroshenko being pro-Russian candidate. It did not prevent him from moving in anti-Russian direction. So if only the Kremlin, if only Russia wants to have Ukraine as a better neighbor, it should not think or act in terms of replacing bad guy by a better guy. It is counting on changing the whole relationship. That's why we should not focus on concrete names of not very prominent politicians when speaking about Russia's plan.
Okay. Gilbert, we're down to our last couple of minutes, so I'd like to get your final thoughts. And if you could also maybe comment on what the Russian public really makes of this. I'd heard one assessment say that they were very much in favor of what happened with Crimea, but when it comes to eastern Ukraine, they don't necessarily want to see an invasion.
Well, asking about the broad Russian public and their opinion is a nice intellectual exercise, but it has very little bearing on the policy of the Kremlin, just as asking the American public what they think is of the likely developments in the Ukraine issue has any bearing on what Mr. Biden and people around him will do. Foreign policy is by nature the prerogative of the executive branch of government. More broadly, the political establishment in Russia is broadly supportive of what the government is doing. And by political establishment, I mean the people that you see on air, on political talk shows, the leading political talk shows like the one Sunday evening with Vladimir Solovyov. You listen to them and you understand that their position is strongly supportive. You also understand that for them, public enemy number one is not so much the USA, but precisely Britain, because of its role as a ringleader and as a manipulator. I disagree entirely with the notion of transparent British intelligence. You don't have to go back to 2002, 2003. You look at what they've been doing recently. You look at the Skripal affair. You look at the Steele dossier, which was used to discredit and hopefully overturn the whole of American politics. That's manipulative, just as what we've seen in the last week, the so-called disclosure of Russia's plans to install a puppet government coming from Britain is an attempt to manipulate the policies in the United States, where the tail will wag the dog. It will not work. But the Russians and the Russian political establishment has as public enemy number one London, and Britain should be aware that they are targeted.
Okay. Gilbert, yours will have to be the final word, because we are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us and sharing all their insights and opinions, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.